Now and forever, we bring IT to life.
Good day and welcome to the Connect with Remedy monthly webinar series. Today's webinar is being recorded, and at this time I would like to turn the conference over to your host, Mr. Gregory Kioy. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you for joining us for this month's Connect with Remedy webinar. We have Chuck Simpson, a senior product developer, taking us through installing and using BMC Atrium Web Services. Chuck?
Thank you, Greg. Right, let's get started. First, a little bit about me. I'm a developer in the customer engineering division, and I support web services, Atrium UI, and some SSO. So the agenda today, I'll give you a little bit of background information on what web services are and why you would want to use them, and then what the Atrium Web Services are, the Atrium Core Web Services, and what you can do with them. Also, what a web service registry is, a UDDI registry, and why you would want to use it, and how the AWS registry is used. AWS is Atrium Web Services. And then a quick look at the architecture, and then how to install the AWS and AWS registry, and then a few additional topics, and then we'll go to Q&A. So to begin, what are web services? The term is described as a standardized way of integrating web-based applications using XML, SOAP, and WSDL and UDDI open standards over the internet. XML and SOAP are the formatting conventions used, and SOAP is a standard protocol. It's described by an XML schema document that's managed by OASIS, which is an industry standards group. WSDL is a web services description language. It's a self-describing language for the web service. There are tools and clients available that take the WSDL description and turn that into code, into a template or into the actual code that is used to execute the web service. And UDDI is a standardized web service registry. It's used for collaboration between organizations, and it holds, or it lists, it's a directory listing the web services for each company and describes them by giving their endpoint URLs, how you access the web service, and the WSDL descriptions for the web service. And one thing that should be stated up front is web services don't have a GUI, and they're not interactive with the user. Web services provide application-to-application connectivity. So one client application requests a service from the web services server and gets a response back. That's how that's used. There are tools that can make the web services interactive. There's SoapUI and SOA Test are a couple of the ones we use, and they read the WSDL description and provide a user interface that you can customize. And I use it for testing, also use it for other things in development, and customers do the same thing. You can also have strictly programmatic interactions with web services, and things like JAX-WS and WSDL to Java and things like that would provide a program with the code templates for a web service. All right. And what kind of data is shared. It's XML data, and it's formatted as a SOAP request, or when it's when web service returns data, it's a SOAP response. And those are standardized protocols given by XML schema in the SOAP specification. And any data that can be encoded in XML format can be sent in the request or the response, as long as it matches the WSDL description for that XML for that web service. And why you would use web services. It's easy to expose functionality over the network. It's also low cost. All you have to do is write the WSDL description, which is just an XML document, and an XML schema that describes the data types to be used by that web service, and which parameters are required, which are optional. So it makes it easy to use, and it's low cost to develop it. Other applications can discover and use web services by using the UDDI registry. There's interoperability. Application communication occurs using the standardized protocol and XML, so it makes it programming language independent. You can have a client that's written in one programming language and it talks to a web service written in a different programming language. And already said it's low cost, and also better security, because the web service server is the only entity that has access to the database and file resources, and it's the only one that can access those. The actual client cannot get access to it. Another reason to use it is availability. A web service server can be replicated. It's just like a mid-tier. You can put it behind a load balancer and have it have a high availability that way. It's not really a failover service, but it's you have multiple behind a load balancer. So if one goes down, you still have the others that are behind the load balancer that can take requests. It's scalable for the same reason. You have multiple web services servers, and you can spread the requests over those servers. And the web services can also, the servers can also spread the request over multiple ARs if you have an AR server group or something like that. And encapsulation just means that you can change the resources. So if you change your AR server to use another AR server, or our database, that all happens on the web services back end, and the client applications are unaware of it, and they do not have to be changed when something like that changes. You may have to redeploy your web services on the server, but the client applications aren't aware of anything changing. And I already mentioned programming language independence. So now we can talk about what are the Atrium Core Web Services. They provide access to the CMDB. That's all they do. They provide access to the BMC core forms. They don't provide access to any of the asset management forms or anything like that. It's just the BMC core forms and all the API services that are there for the CMDB. I've referenced AWS overview documentation. It's also in the references at the end of this presentation, and there's a KA with that stuff in it as well. And you can see all the different web services that are used there. What can you do with it? You can manage your CIs, relationships, classes and attributes on classes, business services. You can also manage the queries. You can save the queries and for query by path, graph queries, and you can also perform graph walks, and where you perform a graph query and walk that from the top level CI through its relationships and other CIs. And you can also start and stop RE and normalization jobs and view their events. And you can create and modify data sets. You can also do a few other things. You can audit data. You can view your audit data. And there's even, you can use the impact model and get related services. And there are a few other minor things that you can do with Atrium Web Services, and it's covered in that documentation. And they're kind of categorized and grouped, so that you can understand what you're using. There's Atrium instances, Atrium Business Service, Atrium classes, Atrium Graph Query, Atrium Query by Path. Those are the different types of web service that are listed. And then a web services registry, or a UDDI registry, is it's Universal Description, Discovery, and Integration. And it's a specification managed by Oasis Group. And it provides an XML-based registry for organizations to collaborate and provide web services that they can use to collaborate their business. It's XML-based, like I said. It's also SOAP-based, and you can publish and locate web services, and you can also find out a little bit about the businesses that are providing, or the organizations that are providing the web services by name, product, location, and categorization. They have different categorizations, like SIC codes, the UN SPSC codes, and NAICS codes, things like that can be used to categorize your web services. And you can interrogate all that from the UDDI registry. But the main thing that it provides is the endpoints used for the web service and the WSDL documents. And as I described, the WSDL documents have the protocol bindings and the message formats required to interact with the web service. And that's all listed in the registry. There's a kind of a concept of if you look at the UDDI spec, there's something called white pages, and that's the business info. There's yellow pages, that's the classifications I mentioned. And green pages are the binding information, the WSDL and the endpoint URLs. And that's just a little bit more of that. It's actually 4 different things, but it's broken down into white, yellow, and green pages. And the T-model is the binding. That's the thing that we're most concerned with. And then why would you use the registry? As I mentioned, it's a central directory of web services that organizations use to collaborate. It has the specifications and their locations to find a web service or its WSDL. And the collaborating organizations can publish their web services and consume web services published by other organizations. And it provides indirection as well. If any client application can look up the web service they're looking for in the registry and use the WSDL and endpoint URLs. And if those change and the organization publishes a new location for those, then the client application is not affected because it's looking it up from the UDDI registry. So it provides the indirection kind of encapsulation there. And the AWS registry is it's a V3 version 3 UDDI registry. It's compliant, and it's used in the BMC product stack. It's used by other BMC products besides Atrium Web Services. There's AR Web Services, Service Context, Atrium Orchestrator, BPPN. There may be others, but that's the ones I'm aware of. And the base URL for the registry is found in the System Admin Console. It's in the Server Information tab, WS Registry Integration. So that's how all those different products find the registry and use it. And then here's a quick look at the architecture. The green box at the top is the UDDI registry. The one in the middle is the Atrium Web Services. So that's the AWS server. And the client application is running on this box off to the left. And then there are other BMC web services and application servers here on the right. And they're all using the UDDI server to manage the web services and invoke the web services on the AWS server. So that's just a few of the communication paths. There are other architectures you could come up with, but this is the most common. And as I mentioned, you can load balance AWS servers. They're just a middle tier, just like the mid-tier. And matter of fact, they're usually installed on the mid-tier. So you can have, one or more AWS servers behind the load balancer. And that provides your availability and scalability. And to install it, you use the Atrium Core installer, or the GUI or the silent installer, either one, for fresh installs and upgrades. And there are a few decisions you have to make when you install AWS. One is whether to use an existing web server or there's a bundled Tomcat web server that comes with AWS that you can use. And so the other decisions you would have to make are the Java JRE, the Java runtime environment to use, the HTTP and HTTPS port number if you're using an existing web server, an existing Tomcat or some other web server. You probably don't have to specify the HTTP port. You may have to specify the HTTPS. And then the last thing you have to do is if you're installing UDDI, you have to give it an admin username and password. And one thing, you can install these independently. You don't have to install UDDI if you want to use Atrium Web Services, and you don't have to install Atrium Web Services if all you want to use is the UDDI registry. You can also use a different UDDI registry. You don't have to use the AWS registry. But in that case, you wouldn't have the integration in the protocol stack. You would have to do some additional steps to use that. And then there's one caveat here is that the installer for web services, when it was originally written, it was written for a single standalone server for the Atrium Web Services. The load balanced multiple AWS servers architecture wasn't envisioned at the time the installer was written. So there are a couple of things you have to do if you are installing multiple AWS servers or if you're uninstalling, reinstalling. And there's a KA for that. It's 423631. And it has some steps you have to apply. There are not too many steps. You have to remove some things from a form and remove some things from the Atrium Core configuration document. And then always, before upgrading, back up the currently registered services, and there's a procedure for doing that in the documentation, the online documentation for Atrium Web Services. And then to use AWS, as I mentioned, you can use something like SoapUI or one of those clients, or you can use custom application clients. We also have something called smoke tests that we use to, after installing, we can run the smoke test to make sure the Atrium Web Services are working, or the UDDI registry is working, and that's an example of a custom application. It's it's hard coded. We used JAX-WS to create the template classes, and then created the hard code in the smoke tests themselves. I use SoapUI all the time. As I mentioned, it reads the WSDL file and produces an interactive GUI so that I can put in the parameters and data that I need to use AWS. And I use it most of the time I use it to create models. Sometimes I have to create complex CI models, and it's a lot easier to do that from web services than from trying to use Atrium Explorer. I believe you can also do this with Atrium Integrator, but I find it easier to use the SOAP client to do that. And then security, this is a fairly large topic. So, but by default, it uses SSL and TLS, or HTTPS, as the transport layer security. There is a username and password that's included in each AWS request. It's the AR username and password that you need to access the CMDB. And SSL provides the security. SSL encrypts everything going between the client application and the AWS server. So that's the default. There are also other encryption methods you can use, certificate signing, and other encryptions that you can use to encrypt the web services packets that go back and forth from the client to the server. And there are other things you can use, like timestamps and nonces, to prevent man-in-the-middle attacks. And all that's described in the online documentation. And there's a link here. And then one other thing to mention is AWS doesn't integrate with Atrium SSO. AWS is stateless. The web services are stateless. That means there's no session associated with a web service request or response. And so it really doesn't make sense to use that with Atrium SSO. Atrium SSO requires a cookie, and there's just no cookie available there. And there's some scripts that we provide with the web services so that you can publish your web services and unpublish and find them in the registry. And AR Web Services and Atrium Service Context, they have their own management interface for the UDDI registry. And their documentation for those products for more information on that. And to summarize, the Atrium Web Services product has the web services to access the CMDB API. And the Atrium Web Services registry provides a standard UDDI implementation for the BMC product stack, such as Atrium Web Services and the other products, AR, BPPM, etc. I mentioned this is for BMC core forms only. And then here are some references that I mentioned. And now I can open it up for Q&A.
Thank you. Paula, if you would be able to give instructions on how they can signal if they have a question.
Certainly, thank you. To signal for a question, please press *1 on your touch-tone telephone. Also, if you are using a speakerphone, please make sure your mute button is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. A voice prompt on your phone line will indicate when your line is open. Please state your name before posing your question. Once again, *1 at this time for questions, and we'll go to our first caller.
Hello, Luc Bouchard here from Calm Technologies. I have a couple of questions. I don't know if we have time, but you mentioned that AWS can now be installed on multiple servers, and you also mentioned that it could be installed on the same server as the mid-tier. Is that the new best practice?
Yeah, I believe it is. That's what I advise people to do, is install Atrium Web Services on the mid-tier and install UDDI someplace else, either on the AR server or a standalone server.
Okay, because the deployment architecture diagrams don't show that as the practice, so that means something needs updating.
Yeah.
Second question, can the UDDI registry be load balanced, or is it still only a single UDDI within the stack?
It could be load balanced. I mean, it's just a middle tier server, just like the Atrium Web Services server. So it could be load balanced. It's not usually done. There's usually not that much interaction with it, but it could be if that was a concern.
And then the last question, RESTful API, is that in the plans?
There is a RESTful API. It has not been used very well, and I didn't mention this, but I think the architecture document shows this is based on Atrium Web Services are based on the Access 2 Apache framework. And the Access 2 framework is a SOAP-based framework. So even if you use the RESTful API, Access is going to convert it to SOAP on the back end.
Thank you.
Actually, this is Doug Mueller. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So in response to the question, the RESTful API, I think the question is actually saying, when will a full-fledged RESTful API to both Atrium Web Services and AR System be available? Am I correct in that?
Yeah, that is the question.
Okay. And the issue is it's not available in the shipping product at this time. It is something that is being looked at, and you might, although I cannot talk about futures and directions, you might want to consider taking a look at maybe the next release, which should be in the not too distant future of the system, and the possibility may exist that something might be present.
Thank you.
Too subtle?
Oh, I get the prompt, Doug. Thank you.
And once again, it is *1 for questions at this time. As a reminder, please make sure your mute button is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment.
Hey, Chuck, this is Steve Duncan. I do have some questions from the chat room, if I may ask.
Okay.
All right, and then operator will go back to live calls. The first question is, can you also start and stop AI jobs?
No, there's no web service in there for starting and stopping AI jobs at this time. That's something we would have to look at as a new feature in a later release sometime. But I don't know if that's even being looked at right now.
Okay. The next question is, I have seen where the AR Web Services and Atrium Web Services don't use the same UDDI service. Is it possible to have a single combining of both? Is there documentation to cover this procedure?
Well, actually, they do use the same UDDI. They don't have to, but they do use the same UDDI service. When you install Atrium Web Service registry, it registers with the form in the AR System Admin Console, the Web Service Registry Integration form, or tab on that system or server information tab of AR System Admin Console. So they do use the same UDDI server. I think I mentioned that a couple of times, that the BMC program stack uses the UDDI server from the AWS registry.
Okay. And the last question I have here is, Are Atrium Web Services different than AR Web Services?
Yes, they are.
They seem to not want to coexist, and that was the last comment there.
Yeah, they don't really coexist. They're separate. They're both web services, and they're both use the UDDI registry. So from that context, you still interoperate. But they're different web services. They have a different web service server. AWS is Access 2 based. AR, I believe, is still just Access based. That was before Access 2. And AR web services are meant to access the general forms in AR, and they have an interface where you can generate a web service for a particular form if you need it. But I'm not the expert on that. There are some AR server CEs that could answer questions on that. So I don't know what you meant about interoperate. Could that be clarified a little bit?
Yeah, if the customer who asked the question could actually contact the operator and answer this question, and that was the question is, are Atrium Web Services different than AR? Yeah, that's the one. Are Atrium Web Services different than AR Web Services?
Thank you, and we do have a caller in the queue. I'll open that line.
Okay.
Hi, this is Jim. I've just noticed when we do the installs, we seem to have real issues between AWS and AR Web Services. And maybe you answered it because they're basically using two different versions of the Access.
Yeah, that could be it. I don't believe there are any class manager problems, but at least I haven't noticed any. I'm the customer engineer for this, so if there was any customer problems that came up like that, I would have seen them, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so I haven't noticed any problems like that. Although that there could be problems in that area that I'm unaware of.
Okay. And one follow-up question. So we can do AR Web Services using the Developer Studio, but there's no visibility into the Atrium Web Services.
Yeah, that's correct. As I mentioned, the AR Web Services, you can generate them on the fly, and that's what you do with the Dev Studio. And Atrium Web Services are more hard-coded for the CMDB API.
Okay, so you're using some type of a different development environment to generate those web services?
Yeah, and it's purely done in development, and we release the web services as a package. It's actually as an expanded WAR file is how they get deployed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then one last one. Documentation.
Before we go to the next question, I just want to expand a little bit on that answer.
Sure.
The Atrium Web Services are a fixed set of web services. You do not get to adjust them. They are inherently tailorable because you specify which class you're talking to, etc. And so they're inherently kind of designed to the CMDB. But you're not allowed to create a new web service, a new call, if you will. Whereas on the AR side, you are actually creating the web service definition. You define a form, whether it's one of ours or one you've created, and then you create the web service, and you say what the parameters are and things. So one case, we're helping you build the web service calls. That's on the AR side. On the CMDB side, we actually supply them predefined. That's why one you get to build in Dev Studio because you are actually building a web service call. The other ones are not buildable. But although they are flexible in that you can specify which class and which attributes and things you're talking about, but they are fixed services. That's the difference between them.
Right. Well, it seems like the Atrium Web Services are much more abstract than the AR Web Services.
That is correct. They're a set of abstract classes. You can do anything with them, whereas the AR ones are very specific to specific operators, and you design them for specific tasks.
Right. Okay, and that's understandable. And then the documentation, right now it's just basically spitting out essentially WSDL, there are no examples of consuming web services or, you know, parameters, what's the expected parameter value, things like that.
Yeah, there are some, that documentation has two parts, I think. If you look at the API overview, there's a set of, there's the API functions or operations, and then there's the API data structures. And the data structures will help somewhat. If you have problems with that, you can always contact me. I think my email address is on this, but you can contact me. I have quite a few examples that I can provide.
Okay, great.
If you're using SoapUI, I can just, export a project for you.
Yeah, and that's what I've done and found to be the most effective approach is using SoapUI to generate the stubs and then take those and then use those for implementation. Okay, that's it for me.
And there are no further questions on the phone lines at this time.
We do have more questions in the Q&A section, so let me jump right to those. One moment. It says, with Remedy on Demand, can the customer extend or modify the WSDL to expose other forms? Does BMC support this?
No, that's the short answer. As Doug mentioned, these are canned web services that use the CMDB API, and so you don't get to go generate a new web service call with Atrium Web Services like you do with AR Web Services.
So just to clarify, that's a no to Atrium Web Services, but if it's an AR web service, yes, you should be able to.
Yeah.
So it depends on the question. The question doesn't specify which type, and some of the questions have been mixing them, so I just want to be clear. You cannot change or expand the Atrium Web Service because it's a fixed set of web services, but if you create a new AR web service, that should be fine.
All right, thank you.
On-demand environment.
The next question is, can we do a secondary install of AWS in a server group?
Well, AWS can be installed like I showed in the architecture diagram behind a load balancer. It's usually the best practice, I guess you would say, is to install the Atrium Web Service server on the mid-tier server. So when you're installing Atrium Web Services and you're asked which web server to, Tomcat server to use or whatever web server you're using, it usually uses the mid-tier server for that box as the initial Tomcat server. So the question is yes, you can do that, but I'm not sure that I understood the full question there. If the caller could come on and clarify that a little bit, I think I can answer your question.
All right. While we wait for the caller to contact the operator, we'll ask another question here. At which point in the web service call is the date time converted from what is stored in the database?
Okay. Well, yeah, access from what is stored on a database. So I assume you're doing a get date time and not a set date time. It will take the value stored in the in AR in the database and convert that to a time value that is localized for the current time zone. Is that good enough, or do you need more information?
If the caller would contact the operator if you need more information, that would be fantastic. The next question is, I don't believe we covered this one, but how do I register any AR web service to AWS? Can you point me to the relevant docs?
How do you register any AR web service? Register with the UDDI registry? I assume that's what you're saying. There is the AR web services should have their own management interface for that to publish the web service to the UDDI registry. I'm not aware of what that management interface is, but I believe there's one for AR Web Services. I know there's one for service context. That's about the only answer I can give you right now. There are scripts in the AWS registry product. When you install it on a server, on that server there's a directory with some scripts that you can use to manage web server the UDDI registry and add, publish and unpublish and find the web services there using those scripts.
Yeah, at this time, ITSM, I don't know of any feature in ITSM that is requiring web services, the AWS web services. And there's no feature of AR that requires that you interact via web services. So, the registry is not required, but something that you do want to consider is if you are using web services of any kind, whether you're using Atrium Web Services, whether you're using AR Web Services, or using any kind of web services, you do want a registry. The registry records which web services are available and where to route things. And the standard way someone that's writing a web service call is going to interact is they're going to go to a UDDI registry to WSDL, the definition of the web service, and they're going to say, hey, which one's available? Oh, here's the definition of it. And then they're going to fill it out and then route it. Now, you could argue, hey, I already have the definition. Do I need the registry? I still need to know when the web service call is made, where do I go? Because the web service call itself doesn't say where to go. If you look at a web service call, it doesn't have routing information. It doesn't say go to server Q. That may be part of the context of it, but it doesn't have that routing data. And it uses the UDDI registry to find out where to route it for processing.
Yeah, Doug, that's the UDDI provides the WSDL location, the URL. It also provides the endpoint URL where you access the web service. The WSDL also provides the endpoint URL. So you usually use UDDI to find out where the WSDL is to get the URL for the WSDL, and then the client application will read the WSDL, interpret it, and create the template or whatever it's going to do, and then send the web service request to the endpoint URL found in the WSDL. So you use the UDDI for indirection so that, if that ever moves, it doesn't affect the client.
And gentlemen, we do have a caller in the question queue.
Luke Bouchard again from Column. A comment on the server group install. I know for a fact the installer will not allow us to install AWS more than once. It actually looks up in Remedy and says it's already there and stops. So I think that knowledge article you talked about will allow us to do that multiple AWS installs, so that's good. My question is actually around a use case that we have with a client around getting data out of the CMDB, consuming it, and then pushing it back in again to an import data set. And the trouble we had is that with asset lifecycle status no longer in the core CMDB forms, it was impossible to get a list of CIs that are not in the deleted state. Is there any chance that that's going to change in future releases where we can call other forms outside of the core forms? And to follow that up, when pushing data back into an import data set, there's no function that allows me to use any other field than instance ID as the key. Is that going to change as well, potentially in the future?
Not that I know of. The asset lifecycle stuff moving, in 8.0 or 8.1, I don't remember when, the asset lifecycle information was moved out of the BMC core forms and into the asset forms. And CMDB, or the Atrium Web Services only accesses the CMDB BMC core forms. So it doesn't have access to that asset lifecycle information anymore. You have to use AR Web Services to get that. I know there was an effort in the last 6 months or so to make sure that AR had the web services necessary to access those that asset lifecycle data. So it's it's not going to be available within the Atrium Web Services, but it is available in AR Web Services. And as far as let's see, what was the other part of that? You were trying to
So creating a new CI and an import data set using some other key field than instance ID, because the external system doesn't know anything about instance IDs.
Okay. Yeah, I believe it's all based on instance ID. I don't know if you may be able to use reconciliation ID, but I'd have to go back and look at the schemas, the XML schemas for that to see if instance ID is required. I believe it is. So I believe you're correct there.
Documentation led us to believe in earlier versions, in 8.0 for example, led us to believe that if you use set instance, it'll create an instance ID for you, but it doesn't work in 8.1. And secondly, somebody wrote some code at one point to try and get around the instance ID issue, and they weren't able to. So it was impossible to create a new CI without having an instance ID. And then of course,
no, set instance only works on existing CIs. If you want to create a CI, you have to use create instance.
The 8.0 documentation states that set instance will create an instance for you if it doesn't exist.
Yeah, somebody brought that up to me. It came up in an escalation I received, and I put in a documentation defect for that. But I can go back and revisit that and make sure there's a comment in the documentation so that they take care of that. But that was just flat out wrong.
At the end of the day, there seems to be a gap here in an external system being able to push data into the CMDB using AWS because of the fact that you have to use instance IDs, which of course it knows nothing about. Right? There's no way to deal with that, especially if you're taking data out of asset and putting it back into an import data set. There's no way to do that, right? So
So this is Doug. You need to be careful about the way that our APIs and the interaction exist. You'll find that a create operation creates a new instance. A set operation updates an instance based on the instance ID. If you want to find something other than the instance ID, you use a search operation, find the item, get its instance ID, and then do the set. The same model we use against the C and Java APIs. Currently don't have the search and update calls. We actually have separated those as different operations. And so the operation you would need to perform is first a search call to find the item, and then you set it. That's the model you would have to use. We do not have a search and update.
Yeah, or if you're searching one data set and trying to import it into another data set, you would search it, read it, get it, and then use create instance to create a new instance and import data set.
Or set if it's already there. But the idea is we do not have a set and update, a search and update call. We just kind of separated our calls into, you've got get, set, create, delete, and search. There's not search and update.
Yeah, the issue we ran into is that there's no key in the external system that they could use to do that search and update function because they were pulling data out of asset and then setting it back in to go and eventually update that data. And their external system was very limited in its ability to store data, so we never found a way to get around that.
Well, and again, at this point, with the way that things are structured, that you have to do the search, and you can search whether you're searching an asset, you're searching the CMDB, it doesn't matter. The instance ID is present in both places, right? And so you have to do the search and then take the piece of data you got back and then do your set or create. It has to be two steps. If the external system can't do that this time, we do not have a combined web service. They are two different. You have to do it as two steps.
Excellent. Thank you.
And that is all the questions we have in the queue at this time.
Hi, Chuck. This is Steve. I've got 3 questions queued up for you.
Okay.
The first one is, when using web services within Atrium and Remedy, what log files are used to troubleshoot to see how it's connecting and evaluate errors?
Okay. The Atrium Web Service server is usually a Tomcat server. The bundled server with it is Tomcat server. It can also be installed on WebSphere and WebLogic and other web servers. But for Tomcat, There's the, on Windows, it's the STD out log for that web server. If you installed it on the mid-tier, you would just use the mid-tier's STD out log. If it's on an independent or bundled Tomcat, you would just get the STD out or the Catalina.out for that web server. For UDDI registry, there is also a JUDDI log file. So that would any UDDI errors will be in that log file. And that's the two main log files. And there's I have information on how to set up debug logging for that if necessary, but it's basically the same as you would do for the mid-tier.
So it sounds like what there is there's logging for the registry. So if you're having problems with the registry, you turn on the registry log. There's logging at the kind of the web service processing layer of whatever component you're existing in. We don't really have anything special there. We're using the Tomcat or WebSphere or WebLogic logging to tell that. And then once you get past the web service call delivered, then you're dealing with just like API calls. That web service is transferred into a regular API call to the AR server or the CMDB, depending on what web service you're using, and then you use just standard, API, CMDB, filter, whatever logging to track it if it's a logic error within the logic. So it depends on which place your error is at. Is it at the registry lookup? Is it at the web service delivery and arrival level, or is it at the logic behind the scenes? And so there's that 3 layers, and you turn on whichever combination of logs you need to find the problem depending on where it's occurring.
Yeah, the only real issue I've seen with logging is the web service logging is it's configured without a timestamp in the log, which baffles me why that would have occurred. But I have when you set up debug logging for web services, I've got an example that shows what you need to do to set up debug logging, and it also adds the timestamp in there so that we can correlate anything in the log file with the JUDDI log or anything else that we need to correlate with.
So could you get that done, written up as either a KB article or a communities post, and then put the link to it in the Q&A session?
Yeah, I've been meaning to put it into a KA. I'll do that.
Because that way everybody can have the way to turn those on most effectively.
Yeah, and I can probably have that done today, and I'll get it to Greg so that he can add it to the references section on this when he publishes it.
Terrific.
Okay, Chuck, here's a good one. I believe I heard that there is a web service to walk down a tree. Is there also one that walks up a tree? For example, I have server XYZ, and I need to walk it up to see what service it affects.
Yes, the GraphWalk API, I even have an example of it. So if somebody needs it, I've got a SoapUI example of the GraphWalk API, and you can walk it top down, or you can walk it bottom up, or you can do both.
Yeah, so the idea is it's the same call is the answer. The same exact web service, one of the parameters is which direction are you going?
Yeah, that's correct.
And the directions can be up, down, or both.
Yep.
Okay, I'm actually down to final 2 questions. See, is the registry needed for the service context feature of ITSM?
Yes, it is.
That was easy enough. The last question here is, ARS has a plugin for AWS, I think. Can that be disabled?
There's no plugin that I know of. There's a CMDB plugin, but that's normal. But there's no plugin explicitly for AWS.
Okay.
I am not aware of one either. I was a little surprised when I saw that. I don't believe there is a plugin specifically for that. AWS is a module that you do install to allow Atrium Web Services to work, but it's not a plugin to AR system.
Okay, thank you. This just came in. Can you use AWS with IIS and Tomcat? using the IS API redirector as it can be used in AR system mid-tier?
I don't know. I would have to look at that. I probably need a little more information on that use case as well. I'm not an expert on IIS, so yeah, I would, somebody can send me an email on that and I can find out, but I don't know right now.
This looks like we're at the point where we're going to be asking for last call for any questions, live with the operator or within the Q&A section.
As a final reminder, star 1 on the phone lines. And there are no phone questions.
Okay. Well, that wraps up this month's Connect with Remedy monthly webinar series. Thank you very much for joining. We will get this posted to the communities within a week of
Now and forever, we bring IT to life.